Today, we're getting real about self discovery and the complicated relationship between people and alcohol. My guest spent years in that battle, and now, over 2 years sober, he's here to share what that journey really looked like. We'll talk about how alcohol shaped his life, the moment everything shifted, and the messy, not so linear road to recovery. And stick around. By the end of this episode, he opens up about the unexpected gifts of sobriety and shares a piece of advice for anyone standing at the edge, wondering if they can take that first step. This is the diary of the soul, because behind every face is a story, and behind every story is a lesson. Hey Tim, welcome to Diary of a Soul. I'm thrilled to have you here today.
Hey, Alvin, thanks for having me.
Yeah, of course. And I want to kick things off with our opening tradition, which is what's one thing, big or small, that you did yesterday that brought you some joy?
One thing, big or small. What did we do yesterday? I would say the leftovers
Eating leftovers.
from your mom's house.
Yeah.
Yeah, that was the highlight. The mac and cheese.
Why?
That's my favorite food group. So,
For me, it was watching The West Wing because I'd never watched it before. And
that makes me really happy to hear because I love that show and I didn't ask you for your feedback afterwards. So,
Yeah, well, it's still early days, but it's nice to start watching a show with someone.
yeah, you haven't met the president yet.
Yeah, exactly. That'll
So,
be tonight's mission. So, yeah, today I want to talk to you about alcohol and sobriety.
mhm.
And I think alcohol carries a bit of a mythology in our lives. You know, it comes from somewhere, or at least it starts somewhere and is shaped by culture and the people that are around us and our environment. And I want to go back and explore those early experiences that influence your story. So, growing up, what was the relationship like with alcohol with the adults in your life?
Well, in my family, my stepfather was and still is an active drinker. And he came into my life when I was maybe 6 years old. Um, so, more than 20 years ago. My mother's father was also an alcoholic. And I can't remember which one I was aware of first, but I certainly remember my mom's stories about what it was like for her growing up in an alcoholic, abusive home. At the same time, I was living that experience in my home. Um, so I was exposed to it firsthand and also um, in my environment, but also biologically, it was part of my makeup.
Yeah. And did your mom drink as well, or?
I was just thinking about this earlier today. It's crazy you ask that because I was trying to picture my mom with a drink and I could not think of a single time I saw my mom with a drink. Certainly not drunk or tipsy or anything like that. Um, and same for my biological father. I never saw anyone in my family drink uh, like that other than my stepfather. And then, of course, my siblings when I was at that age.
Did either one of your parents ever offer you a drink when you were younger?
I vaguely remember drinking some beer when I was really little, like somewhere between 5 and 7. Not drinking an entire beer, having a sip of it. And who I can't remember if it was my stepdad or from earlier, my mom's boyfriend but they thought it was funny, that I had. So I don't know. I mean, it sounds crazy to say. I think it was harmless and funny, but that's the first instance I can remember.
Do you remember your first actual drink?
I know that there were times probably when we were on beach vacations when it probably was an inappropriate age to be offered a drink that I would have one. Um, I still don't think of those instances as my first drink because I don't remember associating it with anything other than this tastes bad. And but the first time I would consider, like, when I was, like, heavily drinking blackout drunk would have been when my sister, who is 3 years older than me, was in high school, and my mom and stepdad were out of town, and her boyfriend came over, and they brought beer, and I started drinking, and they thought it was hilarious how I was behaving, so I kept drinking more, blah blah blah. So that's what I would say it was my first time, was at home, um, with my sister.
Right. And what was that experience like for you, your first drink?
It was awesome, really. I mean, some of their friends were over, um, and I was a very shy, awkward kid. My sister was very popular in school, and at that time, I was not. Um, so to be part of that group, um, to be funny and the center of attention, uh, it was great. And I remember also, because we were upstairs in the computer room or the game room, and after they left, I think there were still beers around and I kept drinking. Um, but I got on AIM, Instant Messenger, and started talking to my friends, drunk. And, I thought I was hilarious. And there were inside jokes from that night, uh, from friends, like, years afterwards, quoting silly things that I'd said. So, and then finally went downstairs to bed and laid in bed and just remembered the very distinct feeling of this room is spinning. I mean, this bed is actually spinning. Um, and getting up the next morning when my mom was home and feeling really bad, but behaving like I was fine. So that was also start of a little pattern.
Yeah, there's some interesting parts to that story that resonate because I remember when I first started drinking, how fun it felt, especially to drunk dial people and leave them these insane, hilarious messages. Um, and in a way, you kind of did that too. You're just drunk messaging people. And I think it builds a fun rapport with people, especially if they're drunk and doing it as well. And this sort of shared reciprocity and like being silly or acting out of character and using alcohol to accelerate that behavior.
Right. And this was even before cell phones. I mean, that's how long ago. I was pretty young, I guess. So uh, that would become a trend in my drinking as well. Regrettable messaging and texting and all of that. Um, so that was the start of that, I guess.
So it starts as really this closed circuit within your family, you know, introduced to alcohol, and it's almost like a joke a bit to your parents just to like give you a sip, and then now you drink more with your sister and explore it more. And it's a story that I feel like a lot of our friends have, just finding alcohol in high school or college, and it's fun and it's lighthearted. And even though you may be hungover or you make mistakes, it's almost like you're allowed to do that, especially at that age. And I kind of wonder, when did alcohol start taking that turn for you? When was it something that wasn't so fun?
It happened pretty early on for me. And I think it was the way that I drank from almost the very beginning was abnormal. I don't know what it's like for the average person to drink or the positive feelings you experience, the letting go of inhibitions. That for me was addicting in itself. And I didn't feel the regret the next day and think, I mean, I looked forward to when I could do it again, when I could be that funny person. I I mean, it probably would have been high school when I would say my drinking was problematic. Certainly by freshman year of college, it was abnormal, um, and out of control.
Yeah. So describe a scenario, like what made it abnormal, or what did you
Sure.
see that made it out of control?
The amount that I would drink, for one, huge quantities of liquor. I remember where I grew up was the country. It was winding roads. It was, and we would go in the woods. One of my friends, we would go out, and I don't even know where we got the alcohol. We always had a bottle of something and drink until near blackout. And, I would drive home, and the county I lived in, it was pretty sprawling. I mean, it would be 20 to 30-minute drive down dark, winding, can't see around the bend kind of roads. And I would drive and drive, and I would, you know, speed, thinking that I needed to hurry up and get home before I blacked out. Like that was my thinking. So my bedroom was on the first floor of our house. There was one time where I woke up, um, having pushed the window into my room trying to get it open. The entire window fell out into my room, and I was like, woke up asleep on the floor inside, right inside my bedroom, next to the window, laying on the ground beside me. That I I mean, I genuinely don't know, because I don't, I mean, how kids party, but I'm assuming that was is not the average experience, and that was normal for me. Um, regular experience, um, and that was high school age.
So while you're having these abnormal and or out of control moments, how did it affect the people that were around you? You know, how did it affect your sister or your friends or your parents?
You know, I would say my parents, not at all. They didn't even know. My sister, I'm assuming that after that one time that I drank around her, she also didn't know. That's less indicative of me hiding it and more indicative of my family dynamics and the way that I could go off unnoticed. And there wasn't a lot of guidance or, um, concern about what my experience was in general. It's I think even though that behavior I described was problematic, I don't recall friendships necessarily being affected until probably college, but I was known to do crazy things in high school. I think it was seen as funny or wild or not hurting people.
Yeah, I think it goes back to how I described that age range, that 18 to 24, where it's really okay to be out of bounds.
Right,
And I also don't think that, at least I wasn't equipped to be able to pick that out in someone and say, hey, maybe they have a problem because it's so socialized.
right,
You do activities with drinks.
yeah.
And so I'm curious, was it ever something that you realized it was a problem at that age, or is it something that you've realized looking back on everything?
It was around that age. I know for sure, at least by the summer after graduation, before going to school, I looking back, I can already see that I only surrounded myself or started to surround myself with people who were doing the same thing, or at least didn't mind what I was doing. So, my boyfriend at the time, he drank the same way, and he was a twin. His twin brother drank the same way, and we would do cocaine. And this is I was 17 still at this point, and I remember things like missing work, having these huge blowout fights with him constantly. It's very vague though. My experience is a little hazy, but I certainly I would say by the time I left for college, I knew, and I didn't even make it a semester into my freshman year of college before dropping out. So it was a very rapid drop.
Well, and what was the first, I guess, wake up call? What was that first, like, hard hit a brick wall moment where you realized something had needed to change?
I really wish I could pinpoint a moment that I first acknowledged the seriousness of the situation. One thing I think that is maybe kind of unique about me when it comes to alcoholism and addiction is that I did not spend any time that I can remember in denial of the situation, which I do think is kind of rare from what I've heard. But I can't remember exactly when I understood, I guess, the real difference between liking to party and having a serious medical condition. I do know that by the time I dropped out of school, I moved back to Richmond to live with my boyfriend, and I was going to school here in Richmond, but not going to class, having these like crazy fights every day with him, emotional, physical, and during our breakups when we were out in the world seeing other people, whatever, it was always some chaotic situation that I was creating. I remember someone calling me the town drunk, and I even laughed at the time because I was like, I'm 18 years old. I'm not the town drunk. But it is interesting looking back to see that other people could see it. I, when I was that young, even if I didn't fully understand what was necessary for recovery, I do know that I was making almost constant attempts to stop, just on my own, not sharing it with anybody, but seeing how many days I could go. And that would have been around that age, 18 or 19.
And so, what kind of like cycles do you feel like you found yourself in? And what do you think alcohol cost you at that age? Because, I mean, one, it already sounds like it cost a bit of your education at that age, but were there other things?
I really struggle to distinguish between life circumstances at that age and the alcoholism. I had so many problems from the environment that I grew up in, and also issues with mental health and trying to navigate in a world that I had no instruction manual for. It's hard to say what would have inevitably happened at that age with or without the drinking. But certainly, I don't think my romantic relationships, at least, would have been so toxic, so explosive. I don't think I would have dropped out of school. I don't think I would have started going into debt all that early on. Those were the things at that time that, but again, it's hard to say what I would have experienced anyway. Certainly the drinking wasn't helping the attention that I needed to put towards my self-care and mental health.
Yeah. And what did you mean by debt? How did drinking increase or start your debt?
Just taking out credit cards, you know, um, paying for things with credit cards because I couldn't maintain a job, which also reminds me of needing to sort of be bailed out of situations with my mom's help, which I don't think would have been necessary if I had not been drinking.
In those moments where you sort of were playing, I guess, a bit of a game with yourself and trying to stop and seeing how long you could stop. What was the longest break, or what were some significant memories you remember when you would be sober in those days?
I remember little moments where I would feel healthy and clear. And I had a friend at one point, um, when I still lived here in Richmond, we would bike around the city and go and play soccer and eat from the healthy grocery store. And, I just remember feeling like this is a different way of life. This kind of energy is not what I'm used to. And there were little highs, from those experiences that I can remember feeling centered, but they were very short lived. Generally, it would be a handful of days that I would make it. sober. So no long periods of time. I remember I would, I don't know why, on the inside of my bedroom door, um, on the door frame, it was sort of unfinished wood, and I had a pencil, and I would write down whatever the date was, and then whenever I drink again, I would scratch that date out. And whenever I was ready to stop drinking, I would write that date. Okay, this is the day. Scratch that date out. And it was, I mean, it just went on and on and on and on and on and on and on. Yeah.
So it sounds like you've had a lot of try fail cycles, in
Oh,
the early days.
countless, hundreds. Yeah.
And so, what was that first really big chunk of sobriety where it seemed like something that wasn't so temporary?
That would have been when I was 21 and I was living in New York. And I was constantly putting myself in dangerous situations. The way that I lived was totally unhinged. And some of the horror stories that I tell, it's wild to think that it was the norm for me. I mean, these bizarre scenarios were happening multiple times a week. Um, and there was this one night I was going out with my roommate who was a nightlife writer, and I would go out with him to wherever the party was that night, and it was some club in uh, the Lower East Side, something I don't remember, but um, there was an open bar, which was my thing, of course, and I I even okay. So by that time, by 21, I was already trying to drink alone for the most part because of some of the situations that I was getting into. So I would try at times to just drink at home. But anyway, we were out and I blacked out in the bar, which that's another part of my story. I blacked out every time I drank. I mean, that was the goal. I mean, not consciously, but that's you drink until you can't. Um, so I was in this bar, and it wasn't even a bar. That it was a nice like lounge, like hard to get into kind of place. It wasn't some dive bar, but I was unresponsive, and of course I don't remember any of this, but I woke up. What I remember waking up to was the feeling of I was peeing. Um, I was in a Dunkin' Donuts, laying out on one of the benches at the table. I was still very, very, very drunk. It was morning. I could tell there was like a foot of snow outside that wasn't there the last time I remembered being conscious. I was in the financial district, which, if you lived in New York at that time, you would know there's no reason to be down there. There's nothing. There was nothing there. I had a hospital bracelet on, a bandage on my hand, and I just had absolutely no clue what was going on. unfortunately, well, maybe fortunately, the person from the bar who rode in the ambulance with me the night before looked through my phone and called my mom. So finally, when I came around, sobered up, whatever, I had to speak to her on the phone. And she mentioned AA, said, "Why don't you just try to go to one of those meetings?" Um, and so that night, maybe the next night, I went to a meeting, and that started my first significant amount of time sober, which was, I don't know, a year. I can't remember. It was a year, maybe.
What was AA like? Describe that first session and what you remember from it.
The meeting was called the Mustard Seed. It was in Midtown Manhattan at night on a weeknight, and it was in some church basement, I think. This was so long ago. Um, and it was packed. And the structure of the meetings in New York, there would be somebody who qualified, which meant that they would tell their story for 30 minutes at the front of the room. And then they would call on people to speak, um, ask questions. That was generally the structure. And I can't remember what story the person told, but it was weird and funny, and there were parts of it that resonated with me. And there was some point when they went around and you were supposed to raise your hand if you were new or if you were counting days from 1 to 90 of sobriety. And I raised my hand and said, "I'm Tim, I'm an alcoholic." And that was probably the first time that I had said that, even though I already knew. And I said it was my first meeting, and they swarmed me. I mean, like, swarmed me with phone numbers and, "Do you want to go and get coffee? And this is where we all go out to eat after the meeting." And from that moment on, I mean, for a long time, I couldn't hide from anybody. I mean, I was constantly getting phone calls, being checked on, people offering to, "Can I pick you up and we can go do this thing?" It was a very tight community. Um, and the ideas that were shared in AA were fascinating to me at the time. The talk of spirituality um, was so out there. I mean, it was almost trippy, even though it was sobriety. In New York, there were so many people who were artists, and I think sobriety lasted for me that long in AA because of the environment and the fact that the other people who were sober were still interesting people. I mean, they were weird, they were successful, they were artists, they were famous people. Um, it was really something to look up to. So, and it was also my first experience. I wasn't jaded yet. That was the first night, and from that day on, I stayed sober for I think it was a year.
And then what changed?
I have so many stories. I have so many stops and starts, and it's really hard to say sometimes what came first. So many of these experiences blended together. It's really hard to pinpoint. I just remember that I really wanted to drink. And whatever they were telling me in AA that I needed to do to stay sober. I needed to figure out for myself. So I did. I think I might have created a little scenario in which it would be more acceptable to drink. I think there was a relationship at the time. I think I instigated a breakup. I remember very strongly feeling like it was coming on and it was almost planned. I think my return to drinking. But I will say, yeah, it was just that I wanted to drink. I never thought I was fixed now. I could drink normally. I never had that delusion.
Did you ever bring up this upcoming feeling in AA?
I can't remember. Probably not.
Did you ever hear anyone else battle with something similar or share those kind of stories?
People always talked about wanting to drink. When people are planning to drink again, I think that they've already made a decision and they have to protect that decision. So telling on yourself is the opposite of what you want to do. You know, the decision's been made. And in order to keep that, you have to keep it to yourself.
You mentioned the allure of AA in the beginning, specifically the spirituality, and mentioning the structure or network that you get that checks in on you. So, what were the parts of AA that you didn't like?
There were definitely religious aspects to the program, just in the fact that the word God was used over and over again um, in the literature, in the 12 steps. Um, so even though, especially in New York, it was often said to, ignore that wording, change the wording however you want. Take the parts of this program that work for you, leave the rest. Um, Even though that's what I was hearing, it still was unavoidable. The awkwardness of that feeling of being part of this religion or this cult, which at first was appealing because I felt like I was an insider, like I knew something that other people didn't know. It was part of some secret club. It really wasn't until I left New York and tried sobriety other places that the issues that I had with the program just exploded. A lot of preaching, a lot of Bible thumping or big book thumping was what they call it in
Big book.
Big Book is a nickname for the book Alcoholics Anonymous.
The one with the 12 steps.
Right. Well, that's separate book called 12 Steps and 12 Traditions. The Big Book is a collection of stories and the founder's life story. But I'm sure the 12 steps are in it somewhere. But it was culty. It was group thinking. It was big book thumping. It was the constant pressure to find problems within yourself daily, to admit things you had done wrong, to search yourself for wrongs you had done others in the past, to take a moral inventory. It was relentless. And I never realized that until in the last few years. I didn't realize that that was the thing that was actually keeping me from getting sober, ironically.
You felt like it re traumatized you.
Yes. There's also an aversion to science and research. No other method of staying sober can be talked about. It is openly shut down, openly discouraged. Psychiatric medication is discouraged. I mean, looking back at it, when I really look at it, I think it is a very, very dangerous pseudo religion and cult. And I'm very lucky to have found long term sobriety outside of that.
Well, I think deciding to change anything in life can be met with a certain level of friction. So I'm curious when you did decide to turn away from AA, in whatever capacity, whether it was completely or just keeping somewhat of an arm's length and still using some of their steps. Was there resistance from the people in your AA groups when you stopped going?
Absolutely. It was like what you hear about people leaving Scientology. I'm suddenly a dangerous person because I am not following the rules that they need to rigorously live by to maintain their sobriety and to maintain living. Because if you're not sober, certainly you will be dead. And the only way to stay sober is this program. And I am now a threat to that because I am saying it's not working for me, which means, according to their literature, that I am fundamentally incapable of being honest with myself and therefore deeply flawed and beyond help.
And what were some of these other lifelines that you could grab onto outside of AA?
Unfortunately, I didn't know of any, and I had for a long time been brainwashed to think that everything else was a sick joke and people were just in denial. And until they got help through this program, mm,
So, what gave you the courage to shift away?
I don't think it was necessarily courage. I think that I just had so many experiences of relapsing and the little adjustments that are made every time, the information that is gathered every time. You know, once, if this happens over years and years and years, you start to put together a picture of what's helping and what's not. And it can be the tiniest little thing when you come back after a relapse that you learn. And I think in my situation, it was being able to get up, fall down and get back up and pay attention and reflect on what happened. Try something different. But as far as support outside of Alcoholics Anonymous, therapy certainly was a big part of it from a medical professional. I say it like that because a lot of psychiatric help was offered in the program, not evidence based. Yeah, there are a million things, I guess, that I learned to do differently. Then again, there were so many things from Alcoholics Anonymous that were deeply ingrained in me that certainly were helpful in maintaining sobriety long term, just in the sense that I had a better understanding of myself on a practical level what it meant to have the condition of alcoholism.
It's almost freeing, it sounds like.
It was. It was a huge relief to make that connection finally. Um, to have the real lived experience of doing well without it. And even though I had suspected that would be the case for a long time, I hadn't lived it.
What's something you had to unlearn about yourself to embrace sobriety?
To embrace sobriety, like outside of a 12-step program, or
Well, in any case, in whatever capacity worked for you. But I mean, it sounds like leaving AA is what worked for you,
mm,
at least on a longer term scale.
it's something that comes up almost every time I'm in therapy. The way that I talk about myself and pathologize all of my behaviors and catastrophize everything I do. And my therapist has to constantly remind me this is normal human behavior. These are normal human flaws and reactions to stressful situations. AA taught me that I had this unfixable weakness and this fatal uniqueness that I had to unlearn. The tendency to constantly look for ways in which I am bad. Maybe that was part of me before, but AA did not help that. It certainly exacerbated that trait. It has really been freeing to see the humanity in even my mistakes and the quote unquote bad things that I do.
Well, I went from being a active social drinker to a mostly sober person and experienced a lot of change in my life, even with that small shift. And you've had such a larger transformation. And now that you are sober, I'm curious, what are the gifts that you get from your life now?
It's really nice to reflect on these things because if I go back to, say, the last week before I got sober and what that experience was like, if I find problems in my life today, they are luxury problems. I mean, they are nothing compared to what I was living before. So, one, not to just literally be on the verge of death. I mean, that's one thing. Um, my health. Um, if I feel sad or overwhelmed, stressed, unhappy, it pales in comparison to the intensity of those feelings before. If I have a day where I don't sleep, if I have a couple nights where the insomnia is really bad and I go to work and I'm dragging, I feel 100 times better than if I was at work the day after drinking. It's easy to forget those things sometimes and be caught up in the smaller concerns, but just not to be living in constant chaos, constant fear. The financial issues were rough, the constant insecurity in life. Will I be evicted? Will I keep my job? Those are things that I think probably aren't concerns for a social drinker who stops drinking. But today, I have the opportunity to start to rebuild my life, to start to get to know myself better, rebuild my self esteem, my relationship with myself, finding the things that I like about me, things that I like to do, what I can contribute to the world. These things were not possible for me before. All I could think about was drinking and how I was going to protect that drinking and when I was going to drink next. And that was all there was. Literally, that was all there was. Um, so everything is new and everything is better. I sure as hell could not maintain a relationship before. Any relationship that I had, romantic, friendship, family, was always in danger of falling apart and generally did very quickly. So to be able to be a part of a relationship romantically, to not be in constant fear that I'm going to destroy it, destroy my life. I think this is just the tip of the iceberg in the ways that my life is better now.
Do you feel like you found closure with the version of yourself that drank?
I still feel guilt for sure. There's so much that I'm not proud of. And there's certainly still lingering damage today from things that I did when I was drinking. I think I can acknowledge those things and still have closure with that part of myself.
And how does it feel to be around alcohol now?
I'm very fortunate that I don't find it particularly triggering. I'm someone who, from early sobriety, has been able to work around alcohol, work in drinking environments, and have no temptation whatsoever. And that's not an exaggeration. I genuinely don't care. I would say in smaller, intimate social situations, it can be more challenging. I'm still undoing the thinking because this was, 20 years of living like that, where I feel like I have to be drinking to be open or to be charming, funny. Um, so that's why I would say it can still be, in smaller social situations, even though I'm not tempted or anywhere close to taking a drink. Um, it's a lot more, um, the idea of it's a lot more appealing in those situations.
And is there anything you wish people knew about sobriety?
I think it's important to acknowledge that while drinking and drugging will cause more, how do I put this? The symptoms are more obvious. The problems are bigger, they're more dramatic, you know, the DUIs and the fights and the jail and whatever comes with actual drinking. Um, that stopping that is not the end of the journey. It's not, you know, if I were a bad person, I am not suddenly good because I stopped drinking. The problems aren't gone. I often felt a lot of pressure in the times when I would stop drinking to seem okay, act normal. You're not drinking anymore. Seem happy. Go back to school. Have a good relationship. I would put a lot of pressure on myself to seem okay. So I don't know. Maybe I would just like to say that there's a lot more to address than just stopping drinking. I think it's also important to know that the individual who is the active drinker is not the only addict in that situation. They are unfortunately the one who's exhibiting the most obvious symptoms, but it takes a village to create and sustain an alcoholic or an addict. And it's a group effort to create an environment and an atmosphere of healing when one person is expected to get sober. I think the rest should be expected to get well in addition to that.
Well, I have one closing question for you. And that's if someone were on the fence about becoming sober, what's something you would say to them?
Call me when you're ready.
And thanks for sharing your story, Tim.
Of course. Thanks, Alvin.